thank you very much indeed, Joe. And it's lovely to see you all here tonight. It's always lovely to have a full lecture theatre. Thank you very much for coming. And I'd like to just second all of those thanks that Joe's extended to all the wonderful staff here at the State Library and to those at the University of Melbourne, my dear friend Margaret Mannion, Bernard Muir, the two Shawns, those at Monash University who've made it possible for me to be here, and for Petra from the National Gallery, who also gave us a tremendous welcome with the collections there, as did the Baillieu collections today at the university. So thank you all ever so much. It's brilliant to be here. I think this is my third time in Melbourne, and I hope it's not the last. I hope I get out of here alive, actually. There we go. Okay. So I've got a lot of material to get through, so we're going on a bit of a lightning tour, but let's see where it takes us. So this is a book that I published with the Bodleian last year, Art of the Islands, and you can get it for under $50, I think, still online, probably a lot less than that for the second-hand copies that are probably circulating by now. So I hope some of you will get that. Now, what I wanted to do here, I've worked a lot on the manuscripts of the period, but you can't work on them without looking at the other media. And one of my PhDs, in addition to medieval manuscript studies and the study of the scripts, etc., and the art, was medieval archaeology. And for me, l'archéologie du livre is something whereby you excavate all the different layers of the evidence to actually get deeper into the lives of those who made and used such works. And so extending that thesis of the book out into other media again is a very natural thing for an early medievalist to do. This is a book that I never thought I would get to work on. It's the Lindisfarne Gospels, made on a little lump of rock off of the northeast coast of England around 715 to 20. And I remember being taken to see it when I was age 4 by my Irish father and Northumbrian mother, and recalling that I thought at that very moment that rather than be an astronaut, I was going to save civilization by being a librarian. Well, there were a lot of us still working on that one. And when you look at the opening pages, this is the opening of St. Matthew's Gospel in this particular work, you're actually looking at a cultural synthesis, an Esperanto of art, which takes you on a journey from the western Atlantic seaboards to the deserts of Judea, Syria, and Egypt. And so we're going to be exploring that journey and how those many influences should come to bear in a work of this sort. Now, if we were to analyse the different ingredients there, we would find that it's rather like if after this lecture we were to go to the new, Judeo-Indian Italian fusion cooking restaurant. And there would be things on the menu that would actually open up whole cultural Serengetis to us, just those words. Well, in the same way, for the audiences of this period, you would find that things in that repertoire of ornament would make you feel that you and yours were part of this new expansive vision, not only of this world, but a world to come. So again, that's something else that we'll be looking at. Now, the shorthand that academics often employ for early medieval, late Roman, early medieval period art in Britain and Ireland is the term insular, with a capital I, meaning of the islands of Britain and Ireland at a time when they were at their most expansive, outward-looking, rather than insular with a small I, navel-gazing and beset by nationalistic controversies. And you can imagine that works of this sort have become very, very much caught up in subsequent debates about the nature of historiography, history, and their relation to more contemporary politics and ethnogeographies, etc. But insular is still sometimes used, and it's a shorthand that gets you over the tricky question of, is it English, is it Irish, is it Scottish, is it Manx, is it Cornish, does it matter? Oh, sorry, is it Welsh? And there are times when it obviously very, very much does matter, and we'll all go to the sword for it. And there are other times when you have a sense of a more collaborative intellectual, cultural, and even social endeavour. And so it's still probably quite a convenient, useful shorthand for us. Now, I want to whiz us back in time on our journey to the late Neolithic and the Bronze Age. This is a stone circle, Boscawen, in West Penwith, in the western part of Cornwall, and it's one of those that relates to astronomical observations and getting in touch with the movement of the stars, the relationship to the farming year, and relating out from that to international trade and other things. And the British Isles and Ireland are incredibly rich in their prehistoric archaeology and their visible sites. They're very developed cultures. We're used to thinking about Crete and other of the Mediterranean early civilizations, but these too, in their way, are very advanced. And when we look at somewhere like Land's End, which is where I now live, if you're going to do it, do it. And you look at somewhere like this, which seems wild and remote, and for many, many, many centuries and millennia was thought to be the end of the known world. You might think, what has this got to do with high cultural achievement? But in actual fact, in the 1st century BC, the very urbane Sicilian, Diodorus Siculus, wrote of this part of Western Cornwall that he considered it one of the pleasantest and most open places that he'd visited in Western and Northern Europe, because for 2 millennia, they'd been welcoming traders and tourists on the back of the tin mining industry. And of course, the first references in antique sources to the British Isles and Ireland are as the tin-bearing islands. The word Britannia comes from the Britannic Isles, the tin-bearing Isles, the Cassiolites. And so something that now seems to just jut out into the Atlantic on the Bay of Biscay's slipstream is a place where, for many, many centuries, traders from Lebanon, the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians from North Africa, the Romans and others were trading. And it's Cornish tin that made much of the international Bronze Age possible, along with other resources such as the copper from there and Wales. Gold also found in Wales and Ireland, so very, very rich in terms of their metallurgy, and that is really what introduces them onto the world stage, is the trade for those resources. And that trade continues when the Roman Empire in the West finally collapses around 400 under its own weight, and the Roman military certainly is pulled out. We find that on the Western Atlantic seaboard, the wine and the olive oil continues to flow. I can walk out of my front door, I can look in the adjacent fields, and I can find sherds of amphora for wine and olive oil from Egypt, from Lebanon, etc., and from Turkey. Okay. And in 610 AD, John, the Patriarch of Alexandria, was sending the begging bowls around the churches and synagogues of that Egyptian city to raise famine relief for Cornwall, on the basis of 2,000 years of tin trading. So think of it not so much as Land's End as Land's beginning. And when you reach here, you have the option of either going one direction through La Manche, the English Channel, the continent, or you can go the other way and can then take yourself off to southeastern Ireland, to the Isle of Man, to the Hebrides, and onwards to Scandinavia. And that western sea route is every bit as influential, coming out of the Mediterranean through the Straits of Gibraltar, the North African coast, the Iberian coast, both of those your oyster, and then linking in to this incredible prehistoric trade route. And out of that grows the period that we're concerned with tonight, which is the Celtic Iron Age, moving in to subsequent periods in the early Middle Ages. Now, despite Barry Cunliffe's attempts to show to the contrary, the term Celtic is still very, very much in use, you'll be pleased to know. When you look at the Lindisfarne Gospels, you might think of that as Celtic. Well, some of the ingredients go back to what we term Latin Celtic art. You can see the term at the bottom of the screen there. But other things are Germanic, other things are Mediterranean, and other things look even further into Egypt and into the east and up towards Scandinavia. So you can see here an artist's reconstruction of the Iron Age Celts, coming onto the map, if you like, around 650 to 600. And their big advantage is that they're iron users, so their weaponry, their farming implements, they're a horse-borne culture as well, they're expansive, and they've got a technological advantage. Okay. The two major phases of Celtic Iron Age art are called Hallstatt and Laten. Hallstatt after lake dwellings in the Salzkammergut in Austria, where farmers would often be buried with their carts loaded with stuff. Okay, and so you've got a lot of burials there, and it's the artifacts from those burials that give that name to the first phase of around 650 to 400 as Hallstatt. So salt farmers. But their wagons quickly become chariots, and they expand so that in the Latin period, from around 400 onwards, they're present not only in Greece, in Asia Minor, but also expanding throughout Western Europe over ultimately to Ireland, probably even earlier in Ireland in the Hallstatt period. And the two sites, the other one is Laten, which is on the shores of Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland, where the Celts had a tendency to throw some of their most expensive bling in to appease the water deities. And so again, very rich in terms of finds. So visible consumption of wealth, personal ornamentation, etc., all very, very much part of the Celtic persona. These are some of the things from Hallstatt, made of bronze. This beautiful little bowl that shows a calf and its mother going to take the milk that's been collected within the bowl. And here you've got a little ceremonial cart like the one that this farmer was actually buried on, with the goddess Danan holding the sky above with other supporting minor deities. And I think, again, that summons up visions of things more from the Greek islands of similar and earlier periods. This is one of the great masterpieces of Latin art. These are from the burial of a woman in France, the Bazuts flagons. And these, again, are modelled on the sort of Greek export wares for the wine trade. Marseille was founded around 600 specifically to import wine to the Celts. Totally wine mad, still are. And you can see here that you've got interlace ornament, which isn't primarily Celtic, it's a Mediterranean device, which is made out of cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean. And here you can see at the top that the usual sort of lion escutcheons that you would find on Greek equivalents are replaced here by Celtic hunting dogs. And you'll note also there's a little duck that sails up the spout. Ducks are considered sacred to the early Celts. And so you can see that they're being inspired by this, these imports on the back of the wine trade to actually produce very, very beautiful artworks of their own. And so these are all Iron Age Latin pieces. This is the Battersea Shield, a ceremonial parade armour piece which was thrown into the River Thames in London in the probably the 1st century BC. These are some very, very beautiful Irish pieces of Latin art, and you can see some foliate buds and things coming through there, where you can begin to see the origins of the point of abstraction from which this very beautiful, sinuous, curvilinear Latin art derives. There's also a degree often of conscious ambiguity. This is the head of a pin. At one level, it's got trumpet spirals and pelter ornament, which is named after the shape of a Greek shield. But at another level, what does it remind you of? It's a cat. Okay, so you've got this conscious shape-shifting and a sort of ambiguity. Is it human? Is it animal? Is it foliate? Is it abstract? And we think that much of the ornament that could be dismissed as abstract is actually heavily laden with symbolism. And also now, fortunately, unlike historians 100 and 200 years ago, art historians, we now know through the lens of abstract art and symbolist art just how sophisticated things that in the 18th century were thought to be naive, in fact are. This is the Great Truro stone in Ireland, so sculptures as well. This is from County Fermanagh, and you can see here the figures of early monks actually carved on one side and prehistoric head here on the other. And the response to Roman art is also significant, and you find the pantheon of Celtic deities being equated with those of Rome. So if you go to Bath, for example, the baths of Sulis Minerva equate the Roman goddess Minerva, goddess of wisdom, with the Celtic deity Sulis. Okay, and instead of the Gorgon's head, you've got a male Celtic figure going into warp spasm with his lime-washed hair, rather than the serpents that would surround the Medusa head ordinarily. So you've got this sort of cultural synthesis once the Romans take Britain in 43 AD. And this is a talk. This is the sign of status for both secular and for divinities within Celtic semiotics. And again, beautiful, beautiful details from the back of the Desborough mirror, this harness fitting, and this plaque, which was possibly a wall plaque from Ireland, showing how the negative as well as the positive are equally important in constructing your designs. And we can also see how a similar process of abstraction from things like Greek foliate ornament in the Latin period was also to inform the abstraction and the pattern making of the arts and crafts and Art Nouveau movements later. These are some beautiful pieces from Liberty & Co.'s Cymric range that were designed by the Manx artist Archibald Knox, around about 1900. And you can see the plant bulbs, etc. You can see similar points of departure on that process of moving into creating this sinuous ornament. And also a conscious reference back to the Celtic Iron Age and the early medieval period in the naming of it as Cymric. Okay, so British Welsh. Now, one of the other major ingredients in insular art is Germanic ornament. Now, the pioneer of classifying Germanic ornament was a scholar and archaeologist called Bernard Salin, who in 1904 divided Germanic animal art into three categories in typical archaeological style: style 1, style 2, style 3. Okay, well, it works. And this is the early polychrome style of the migration period, when many of the Germanic tribes are moving about, settling different parts of Scandinavia, moving into northern Gaul, etc., and the limes of the German Empire. And you have it characterized by the use of colored glass, blue, green, red, and also garnet work, and we'll talk more about that presently. Now, whether the origins of that grow out of late Roman provincial art or the traditions of the nomadic Asiatic steppes is still hotly debated. Go and have a look at the Scythian exhibition if it's still on next time you're in London. Okay, now style 1 appears in northwestern Europe, and you have 5th century works launching it, such as this chip-carved square-headed brooch. That's where you literally, like lino cuts, gouge out part of the metal to give you your patterning. That's known as chip carving. And you've got animals with their bodies divided into sections bordered by abstract patterns. But again, you've got the same sort of ambiguity. This, for example, is very much like a human face, yeah? You've got his eyes and his nose and his mouth, and these are little faces wearing helmets, wearing sort of helmet skull caps, etc. And you've got a labyrinth down the bottom. So there are all sorts of other things going on there. Then style 2, which is the one that becomes most influential from about 560, 570. And style 2 animals are all interwoven together in interlace. This is a drawing of the famous Sutton Hoo ship burial buckle that actually contained Christian relics, or space for Christian relics inside it. And you can see more clearly there where you've got the beaks of the birds there, for example, and you've got the forearm, the paw of an animal there, and so you've got a whole load of them interlacing. So that's style 2. Style 3 is rather later and relates to different phases of what we know now as Viking art, all again named after different find spots: Borre, Hedeby, Jellinge, Ørnes, which is a beautiful stave church in Norway, and Rangerike. Rangerike, for example, is characterised by the animals getting tangled up in thickets of classical acanthus to chew on. Okay, so that reflects the impact of the Carolingian and Ottonian worlds, etc. Whereas the Ørnes style has this very, very sinuous quality and is born again out of renewed impact from Ireland and the trading centres such as Dublin, Waterford and the other Irish trading towns. Okay, right, so you've got it. You know what Celtic art is now in the Iron Age, and you know what Germanic art is in the three styles. Everybody happy? Cool. Okay, then we've got the Mediterranean stuff. This is the bust of Emperor Constantine on the Capitoline Hill, and he was declared emperor by his troops in York in 312, and then marches on Rome, fights the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, at which he looks up to Apollo's son, as you would, being a good Roman, and sees the cross superimposed on it, and says that he wins the victory in the sign of the cross. He and his Eastern colleagues start introducing edicts of toleration, so after centuries of persecution, Christianity is allowed to be practiced along with other religions rather than emperor worship. And by the 380s, Rome has adopted Christianity as the state religion. Okay, so Britain, most of Britain by this time as part of the Roman Empire would have been Christian. But in fact, the traders bringing their wares from the 1st century onwards, those who were rowing the galleys, etc., are exactly the sort of underclass who are likely to have bought messages of new Eastern religions, notably Christianity, much earlier. And this is a Romano-British mosaic at Hinton St. Mary, which shows Apollo, but now very definitely Christ, because he has the X and the P, which are the Greek letters chi and rho, the chi rho, which is the opening of the word Christ in Greek, which becomes a symbol of Christianity and which Constantine had as part of his own regalia. And flanking the figure of Christ, sorry, I've been lecturing since 10 o'clock this morning, so flanking the figure of Christ, you've got the pomegranates, which are symbols of purity and eternal life, and again, an equation with the redness and the blood of the Eucharist, etc. But look at all of the interlace patterns. Now, interlace, if you go to Pastimes or somewhere and you're buying a scarf, it's Celtic, isn't it? It's got interlace on it. Well, we've seen Germanic interlace. You haven't seen interlace really on much of the early Celtic stuff, but you've seen Germanic interlace, and they've got it in turn from Roman art and that of other earlier civilizations. Basically, every Roman dinner carpet, every mosaic on your dinner dining room floor, from Hadrian's Wall to Dura Europos, would have interlace on it. Okay, and so again, it's a borrowing from a Mediterranean environment. Again, from the post-Roman period, we've got inscriptions on prehistoric standing stones showing that literacy carried on, certainly in the southwest, even after the withdrawal of the Roman civil service in the beginning of the 5th century. And places like St. Michael's Mount, known in antiquity as Ictis, a controllable Roman deep port with a causeway that opened up twice a day, again carries on trading in the post-Roman period. We're also now finding evidence from archaeology in the southern parts of the Irish coast of DNA from people from northern Africa, for example, and even though they weren't part of the Roman Empire, they were certainly trading with it and open to similar influences artistically and culturally. And in 421, the Pope sends Palladius as a bishop to those in Ireland who were already practicing Christianity. And that's before St. Patrick's mission, for example, launched from Britain. Okay, so What happens after the Romans go? Well, you wake up and you say, what did the Romans ever do for us? Central heating, blah, 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 blah. And basically, the two sort of trends start emerging. One is to try and keep the status quo going, keep the internationalism, keep the communications open, keep Christianity going. And that's what you like becomes equated with the Age of Arthur. Okay, the idea of those who are trying to keep that going, whereas others want to, if you like, the Vortigern model of becoming more like ancient Celtic tribal warlords and dividing things into the smallest common denominators. Rather like we're trying to do with Brexit, I suppose, at the moment, but let's not go there. Okay, and so we find that by circa 600, the pressure on post-Roman Britain from incoming Germanic war groups, etc., from the Picts, the ones whom Caesar describes in 55 BC as the painted or tattooed ones who lived beyond the limes, beyond the Hadrian and Antonine walls, is beginning to be felt, and you find that kingdoms are being carved out. So you've got the what become known as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, founded by groups of Angles, Saxons, Jutes, peoples from northern Germany, from Frisia, from southern Scandinavia, all carving out their own territories. East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Northumbria, Mercia, which means the people of the marches. Now, they're the ones who have to keep pushing their way further and further into indigenous enemy territory. And then you get pockets of continued British survival. Strathclyde, Reged further north around Glasgow. Edinburgh was a British capital run by the Gododin, which is subsequently taken by King Edwin of Northumbria, a Germanic ruler, and it becomes Edwin's Burh, Edwin's fortification. Okay. Wales, well, the term Wales is the Old English for strange or stranger or foreigner. And Cornwall is also sometimes known as West Wales. And so the traditional line is that the Romano-British inhabitants get pushed further into the less desirable upland western territories of Britain, or, as Gildas tells us, are forced to emigrate to Brittany. In actual fact, there's now thought to be a lot more evidence for survival and for cultural integration. But we do find, for example, in the Germanic law codes of Kent, when they're finally written down in the 7th century, that there's a subclass called laets, and they're free, they're not enslaved, but they have to pay a higher level of taxation, and they don't have the same honour price or value, if you like, if you commit an offence to them, as a member of the Germanic society. And it's thought they may be the Romano-British inhabitants. Rather, as when Islam comes to expand, it will extend the right to carry on dwelling and toleration to certain groups, but you have to pay a hefty tax hike and other penalties, and you can't qualify for certain jobs and roles in society. That's a little similar to that. So when we look at some of the early migration period burials in Anglo-Saxon England, Sutton Hoo we're familiar with. This is the Prittlewell Prince, who was found on a roundabout just outside of Southend in Essex a few years ago, when whoever buried him is burying him with silver tableware from Byzantium with Christian crosses upon it, with bronze bowls with saints depicted on them from Coptic Egypt, with the wonderful Rhenish drinking horns of glass that you can never put down. They were very popular. And with other things from Scandinavia, family heirlooms, etc. You've got a whole world stage here, and they're signalling that person and their people's place on that international stage. What are their connections? What are their trading links? What are their marital links, etc., their dynasties? And on his eyes, rather than the coins to pay the ferryman, were tiny little gold crosses, similar to those found in burials in Lombardic Italy at this time. And when we look at something like the Lindisfarne Gospels, I would argue that in paint, you've got a similar assembly of visual references to things that show your connections. But this time, it's your connections with a broader world of emergent Christendom that stretches from the Atlantic to the deserts of the East. And bear in mind that the form of monasticism introduced in Ireland and Northumbria in the early stages, Scotland, etc., and Wales, is very, very much the sort of eremitic monasticism of the Desert Fathers, where you have a group of hermits living loosely together and coming together for certain acts of worship, but often doing their own thing, rather than the more military model of Martin of Tours, etc. Well, he was an ex-legionary, why wouldn't he? Where you all live in the same barracks together, you all eat in the same refectory together, which is the communal or Cenobitic monasticism. Okay, so we'll have a look a little bit further about how that works, how that thesis works in a minute. Now, the conversion of the pagan Anglo-Saxons to Christianity is often presented as a two-pronged thing. In fact, there were many, many different influences involved. One of the key figures is St. Columba, who was an Irish prince who becomes a prince of the church. And in 563, he sets off on peregrinatio. Now, this is the idea of voluntary exile for Christ. In Irish law, in the early period, one of the worst penalties that could be exacted, other than capital punishment, is exile. Okay? So to inflict that upon yourself voluntarily, to go in the boat with no oars, wherever your God sent you to do whatever work he had for you to do, and many, many men and women did this, was quite a remarkable thing. And one of the monasteries that he founds is Iona, a little island off of the west coast of Scotland. And this is a 9th century statue from White Island in County Fermanagh, a caryatid in the classical manner, an architectural figure, which shows the distinctive Celtic response of the bishop and the abbot holding his little bell, the monk's mistress. It's a lovely early Irish haiku that says, "I'd rather turn out on a windy night to meet the monk's mistress than a wanton woman." i.e. you've got to get up and follow the bell into church for prayer and psalmody, and the pastoral office of the bishop as well. And in the Roman Empire, when the civil service, if you like, collapses, it's the bishops in their cathedra, their seats in the towns, who carry on a lot of that function. But in rural Ireland, you haven't got towns. They're not formed until the Vikings arrive from the 9th century onwards. And so basically you've got the rural tribe, with their cashels, their forts, etc. And often they would put one of their key men or women from their own royal families in charge of the new monastery. And so you've got a monastery, but whoever's in charge of the monastery is in charge of the pastoral and spiritual well-being of the whole of the tribe. And so the bishop is also the abbot. And it's also claimed that in the 6th century, St. Bridget of Kildare was actually ordained a bishop because it was a natural thing. She was the abbess of the monastery, so it may have been considered a natural thing that she's then made a bishop. There's a lot of contention about that, and it was very, very hastily pronounced non-canonical. So however it came about, you can see that there are certain distinctions in the way in which Christianity is being practiced in the West at this time. One of the reasons, many reasons that Columba sets out on peregrinatio is that he's incurred the first charge of plagiarism and copyright infringement. He's said to have copied a psalter single-handedly, in the manner of the Desert Fathers as a penitential exercise, but he claimed the edition as his own work. His tutor, Finian of Moville, from another tribe, says, no, that's my work, and in fact it's not even mine. It's St. Jerome's that was done in Bethlehem in the 380s. It's not yours. Columba can't take the slight to his honour, and neither can the O'Neill tribe, Inail, from which he comes. Two tribes go to war, massive bloodbath. And when the jurists, because the Celts have a very, very well-defined tradition of a professional meritocracy from prehistory onwards, where the bards, the jurists, the priests, either male or female, were the guardians of group memory with orality, even though they could read and write or were familiar with literacy. They wanted to have that elitist control of knowledge and well-disciplined memories, which Pliny and Plato always advocate. You can't Google everything. There are things that you need to know. And so the jurists proclaim to every cow its calf, to every book its copy. Columba, you're in infringement, and so the two tribes go to war. And when he finally lifts himself up from the floor and realises what he's done, Columba sets off on voluntary exile and starts founding a group of monasteries that will spread across Europe and revive Christianity. This is the Catholic of Columcille, the Battle of Columcille, which is thought sometimes to be that actual manuscript, dating to probably the early 7th century rather than Columba's own lifetime. He died in 597. It may have been made as a book to represent the one that he was responsible for. In fact, the year that he dies, 597, Augustine arrives in Canterbury, rather reluctantly, having been sent by Pope Gregory the Great in Rome and having tried to turn back on many occasions when he was told, you really don't want to go there, they're a very wild bunch. And this is the Augustine Gospels, which we think he brought with him from Rome, with the author portrait of St. Luke, with narrative friezes, the sort of things that would be introduced to England to help inspire more figural narrative art at this time, and written in the beautiful rounded uncial script popular in Gregory's Rome. These two prongs institute a whole range of monasteries and nunneries throughout Anglo-Saxon England, and we find that women also start playing a key role in literacy. One of the earliest examples of writing from post-Roman Britain is a charter for issuing land at Dagenham, where the Ford Works used to be, to the Barking nuns, or rather the nuns of Barking, who we can see here. And here they are depicted in an early 10th century copy of Aldhelm's In Praise of Virginity, which he addressed to Hildolith and the nuns of Barking in the very early 8th century. And they must have been incredibly erudite to read his Joycean style prose. And this is a book that I think was actually made by women. My work and that of Rosamond McKittrick for Gaul has shown that some of the most deluxe manuscripts for the key cathedral altars of this early period were being made by the nuns of Chelles, Famoutier-en-Brie, Corbie, etc., and I would argue Minster in Thanet. In the early 8th century, a missionary called Boniface, who's gone from southwestern England over to Germany, he becomes known as the missionary to the Germans, writes back to his friend, the abbess of Minster in Thanet, saying, please send me more books. Can we have them written in the big script, not the little one? Because my eyesight's not what it used to be. And can I have them in gold, dripping in gold, to wow the natives? Because the performative aspects, going into a hostile conversion environment, to get people to listen to you, you had to put on a big show, okay? And so books dripping with gold to wow the natives are exactly what we find in things like this Psalter from Kent from the 720s, the Vespasian Psalter. And it has all the things that the Lindisfarne Gospel has. It's got Celtic spiral work, it's got Germanic animal ornament, it's got bits of exotic Byzantine blossom, and it's got Mediterranean figures, but all the ingredients are kind of kept separate. What Lindisfarne does is merge them and create a whole new language out of them. This is the earliest example of a historiated initial, telling a story relating to the text. And this is Jonathan shaking hands with David. And between the lines there, you've got the oldest surviving translation of any part of the Bible into the English language, which is a translation of the Psalms added in Kent when the Vikings are at the door in the 840s, 850s. Moving on. The Sutton ship burial, another example of all these incredible goods brought together in a burial in a Germanic ship in Suffolk in the 620s with a Scandinavian helmet, Byzantine christening spoons with the names Paul and Saul before and after conversion on them. Parade armour modelled on that of Roman generals, but with Germanic animal ornament, dragons, falcons, etc. on the shield, and a Celtic manufactured hanging bowl, which we find in many of the early Germanic graves. Anybody who was anybody had to have one. We don't know exactly what they were for, but they're rather like the later medieval Scottish frith cups that you would use and pass round for peace treaties, where you would all drink from the same thing, but there are many other explanations. This is a whalebone casket produced in Northumbria in the early 8th century, and it has on it a number of scenes and inscriptions in Roman capitals and Germanic runes, a talismanic early alphabet. And here, on one scene, you've got scenes from Achilles' life. On the other, you've got scenes from Germanic mythology. You've got Romulus and Remus, founders of Rome, suckled by the she-wolf. You've got the sack of the temple in Jerusalem by Titus. And here you've got a Germanic figure, Wayland the Smith, about to rape his enemy's daughter, Nithard, to get back at her dad, before plucking these ducks and flying off on wings made of their feathers. And as a result of this encounter, she bears a warrior saviour figure. All of that leading through world history to the here and now, where you have a Byzantine-style full-frontal Virgin and Child with the adoration of the Magi and the Holy Spirit as a duck, following on from those in the previous thing. So the analogy of this was then, we're not totally throwing out all of the beliefs of you and your forebears and all of human history, but now we are in a new stage of understanding through the lens of Christianity and the new saviour, the ultimate saviour of the world. So a whole compendium of human history, and we think that was made to contain an Anglo-Saxon genealogy. So you can see how this synthesis of different cultural experiences takes place. And in a missionary environment, you don't go into a mead hall with big blokes who pride themselves on how many people they can kill on the battlefield, how much they can drink, etc., and tell them that all of the heroes and their ancestors that they sing about, from whom they derive their position, are burning in the fiery pit, because you're going to join them there quite quickly yourself. And so again, part of this process of showing points of social interaction and moving forward in a new age. This is an incredible hoard of weaponry found in next to a Roman road in Staffordshire, near Lichfield, a few years ago. 3,000 bits of gold and garnet work. But all of it would have fitted into a saddle bag, and we think somebody had to hide it quick when somebody was catching up with them on the road, possibly a metal worker who was taking them for remelt, although tribute has also been suggested. And you can see how on this sword pommel that this style 2 animal ornament migrates very rapidly into the pages of manuscripts such as the Book of Durrow, made probably on Iona in around the 670s. And this is said Book of Durrow, where you have Matthew's symbol, the man, looking very much like an Anglo-Saxon belt buckle on legs. But look at the tonsure. In actual fact, what you've got there is they're copying Armenian-style manuscripts depicting priestly vestments. There's an awful lot of Eastern influence that my research is working on at the moment, showing just how much contact is still going on with the East. And this is the lion, and you can see this is done in the style of Pictish art with these pronounced spirals on the hips and the double contours. And this is what the text openings look like. And this is a carpet page of ornament introducing each of the Gospels. Art historians call them carpet pages because they look like oriental rugs. In actual fact, they're introduced via Coptic Egypt and taken up big time in Ireland and then in mainland Britain. And I've found reference that we were actually using prayer mats in Britain around the 7th through 9th centuries, as part of the liturgies of the Eastern Christian churches, which Islam also adopt for their early devotional practice. So it is a prayer mat at one level. And you see that the introduction of things like word separation, punctuation, the use of initials to mark text breaks, the whole navigation and articulation of text that then ultimately migrates into print, and which is still informing the articulation of how we look at things in a digital environment. All of these things are being worked out in this Western Atlantic environment on the edges of the known world, which is now doing an awful lot of the work of preserving some of the remnants of the great libraries of the past, Cassiodorus and others from Italy, and which is taking it into a new literate environment and putting centuries of disciplined oral tradition and artwork in other media at the service of the book. The Anglo-Saxon Gospels, made for the foundation of a missionary house in Luxembourg in the 680s to 90s. And one of the other great missionaries, Columbanus, who leaves Bangor in the north of Ireland when he was a very ancient old man of about 52 and should be putting his feet up. But no, he gets aboard the boat with no oars. He and his group of monks row down the Rhine, etc., and found monasteries at Luxeuil in the south of France, Saint-Gall in the top of the Alps, and Bobbio in northern Italy. Again, bringing influences with them all the time, two-way channels of influence backwards and forwards. And one of the things that he wrote that I find quite incredible is, nature is a second scripture in which we behold God. Because one of the distinctive contributions of these islands to this evolving early medieval tradition is looking back into a prehistoric preoccupation with the relationship of mankind to the natural world, the natural environment, and its place within a bigger picture of the celestial realms and creation as a whole. And so if you look at early Celtic nature poetry, it's very, very different in many respects to Mediterranean style poetry, and it introduces a different level of concern with the natural order in art and in literature. Now, this is one of the manuscripts made in Ireland for use at Saint-Gall, one of Columbanus' monasteries in Switzerland, and you'll note that here Matthew is wearing a Coptic bishop's mitre. Exonart goes on to help influence other developments locally, as do many other of the insular monasteries on the continent. And this is an example of work from Exonart from the 750s. And you can see now it's becoming very classicising, looking back to Roman-style iconographies. This is the sort of board that you would put up to show how many times your charioteer has gone round the Circus Maximus. Okay. And this, of course, fuels the early stages of the Carolingian Renaissance in the late 8th century. In 793, Lindisfarne was the first notable place to be attacked by the Vikings, and it sent shockwaves throughout Europe. From Charlemagne's court at Aachen, the Northumbrian Alcuin, who'd been headhunted for his scholarship, wrote back to a monk on Holy Island and said, "This is terrible, terrible, but you brought it on yourselves. You weren't living the ascetic lifestyle of the early Irish founders of your community, Aidan from Iona, a bit rich coming from the luxury of Charlemagne's court, perhaps." But it did send shockwaves. Fortunately, the Lindisfarne Gospels and other of the key relics were preserved. And those relics had functioned as part of the accoutrements of the Shrine of St. Cuthbert, which before the martyrdom of Thomas Becket in the late 12th century was one of the most visited shrines in the Western world. Okay. And he was quite a remarkable person, very much a risk-taker, somebody who was a great advocate for social justice, who challenged the local government on many, many occasions, and so quite a radical figure. And the Lindisfarne Gospels is being made, I think, at the behest of a subsequent bishop of Lindisfarne, one of his successors, in order to be a visual focal point of a lot of these concerns. This is the Royal Fort in Bamburgh, looking out at the little island with the cell with walls so high that if all I could see was the sky, I'd still be afraid the love of money and the cares of the world would get in the way, as Bede has Cuthbert say. So a big challenge to authority. And the abbot of Iona, around about the same time, Addafnan, in 697, gets a statute through in the Irish law codes, the first law in the world protecting women and children and non-combatants in history. Okay? Irish and Anglo-Saxon women at around this time had the best legally preserved rights of any women in the world up until the 1930s. And the making of works such as this sort, as visible places of assembly and journey, acts as very powerful symbols of a lot of these features. So when Wilfrid of York, his cult is established in the crypt that he's built, which he intended to resemble the Holy Sepulchre. This is the crypt at Ripon, when he dies in 709. The book, which is the focal point of his cult, is a purple codex written in gold and silver ink, summoning up the imperial dignity that he's got on one of his many trips to Gaul and to Rome. The book that's made to challenge that at the cult of St. Cuthbert a few years later, the Lindisfarne Gospels, does something very, very different. This is the contribution of the peoples of the north and west and how they situate within that worldview. And so when you dragged your granny 300 miles for a miracle of healing at Cuthbert's shrine, what might you see? Well, the curvilinear Latin ornament might remind you of the brooch you were bequeathed by your Irish great-grandmother. Or you, Sir Sean, might be intrigued by the animal interlace, which reminds you of the belt buckle from your great-grandfather, who was a federal auxiliary in the Roman army and had his own Germanic ornament on it. And all of this within a matrix of letter forms in Latin with Greek letters symbolising the name of Christ. It opens up a whole world. Now, how would you understand that? Well, if you went to visit the Book of Kells now in Dublin and you saw it inside its Snow White's glass coffin, you would be expecting mediation. You'd want the audio guide, the panel text, etc., to tell you something about that. And there would have been viva voce mediation and explanation for sure at shrines of this sort. So it opens up a whole different vision of the world and a harmony to come. Now, again, this simple expedient of the artist of the Lindisfarne Gospels of introducing naturalistic animal ornament, it's a recognisable cat, yeah? Whereas most style 2 ornament, everything is like the love child of an elephant and a vacuum cleaner. Okay? It might have symbolism, but we don't know what sort of species they are. But the cat, of course, for early Christian audiences, from the Physiologian text, was a threat of evil waiting to pounce on the unwary, whilst for the Celts, it's the Cerberus figure, the cat Crutna, who was the guardian of the entrance into the other world. And you can see that this solemn little procession of birds on a Monday morning, all holding the tail feathers of the one in front, not looking where they're going, heading straight for the mouth of the cat, who's already swallowed a breakfast of half a dozen of them. So suddenly, your intertextuality, because it's this sort of period that hypertext and intertextuality were invented, if you like, or certainly carried forward, will tell you that you take a shelf off a book off the shelves of your inner library and interpret this image in accordance with what you've committed to your memory from another textual experience. So it's quite sophisticated stuff. Right, I know I'm running out of time. Will you give me another couple of minutes? Will you? Okay, that's what the text of the Lindisfarne Gospels looks like, and it's one of the 2 best surviving witnesses. When they come to print Jerome's Latin translation of the Bible made in Bethlehem in the 380s at the Reformation, they find that this is one of the 2 books with the best version of Jerome's text within it, made in little islands off of the furthest coasts of the known world. And that was where the scholarship was at by that time in order to be able to do something like this. This is the surviving 7th century fabric of monasteries built at Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow in the 670s and 80s, where the young Bede grew up as a scholar and became one of the greatest scholars of the Middle Ages. This is the 680s window glass from Jarrow and some of the sculptures, very Mediterranean style. This is a Northumbrian sculpture in southern Scotland, the Ruthwell Cross, with the words of the cross which speak as the dream of the rood. What was it like to be felled as a tree and be forced to become an instrument of torture and bear alive the young warrior aloft the young warrior, and then to be buried in shame and to be found by Emperor Constantine's mother, Helena, and covered with jewels and become the symbol of eternal life. So all of these different things all working together. I'm going to speed on. This is one of the great single-volume Bibles made at Monk Wearmouth Jarrow in Bede's period, around 700, that was taken as a gift to the Pope, the Codex Amiatinus, to show just how advanced the culture of these islands was. And this is the version of that figure, the great high priest Ezra from the Judaic tradition, in a more stylized form in the Lindisfarne Gospels, where it's not naive, it's trying to be like a Coptic icon framed and pasted upon the page, but it's also a complex sacred diagram rather than an illustration of a number of important themes. I'm going to have to whiz on. Each gospel in the Lindisfarne Gospels is preceded by a different cross embedded in the carpet pages, a Latin cross, a Greek cross, a Celtic ring head of the sort found in Ireland, and Coptic and Ethiopic tau crosses, different contributions of different peoples to this world order, in the same way as different scripts occur, Celtic Ogham, Germanic style angular runes, Greek and Latin letters all coming together, 4 different languages, 4 traditions, 4 script systems, all coming together like the different witnesses of the 4 evangelists into a picture of harmony. This is a vision of a world within which people could live together, work together, collaborate together, and be part of a bigger environment and place themselves in a bigger picture. And in its espousal of sacred calligraphy, where the words explode across the page and become an image in their own right, we can see that things like Lindisfarne in the later medieval period will find things like Islam and Judaic manuscripts, again, using the logos, the word, the incarnation of God in the form of the word, being the vehicle for decoration and celebration. And this is the place where I think the Lindisfarne Gospels was made, a little lump of rock actually off of Holy Island, off the coast of Northumbria in the North Sea, where for the 40 days of Lent and for the Advent season, the busy bishop was allowed to go on retreat in order to undertake his own work of prayer on behalf of the world and to plug back into the energy source that would allow him to take aid out into the most plague-ridden, war-torn areas of the day. And on the backs of the leaves of the Lindisfarne Gospels are the detailed workings out of Euclidean and Pythagorean geometry. A lot of science going on here, in the same way that Bede is working out the first tide tables at the same time because he's worked out gravitational pull from the moon. So science as well as art, everything coming together. And the bishop making the book on that island, he makes 90 colours, Photoshop tells us, using 6 locally available rocks and plants. He knows if he takes the lichen from his feet on that rock, he can make 40 shades of purple by varying the acidity and alkalinity. And Bede is writing same time, and he knows Bede, they're very close friends, about the temple curtains in Jerusalem and how the 40 shades of purple there represent the journey of the soul. He can't get lapis lazuli from the Himalayas, but he fakes it, using locally available woad plants and suspending crystals of hoof and horn gum in it to simulate the appearance of ground lapis rocks, because the exoticism is really important. And I've evidence from my new work in Sinai of people from Northumbria at this period working in the monastery in St. Catherine's in the middle of the Sinai desert. It's a much bigger and smaller world than we know. And things like the Book of Kells, made probably 100 years later on Iona, around about 800, again carries that rhetoric into a new, wonderful Baroque phase of insular art. Now, I know in the time available we've only touched the surface. That's about 4 centimetres by 3 centimetres in the original manuscripts of the Lindisfarne Gospels. And when you look at that as a visualization, it's perhaps not a million miles away from our visualizations of things like the CERN-Hadron Collider, where for these peoples on these islands on the edge of the known world, their experience of centuries of trade and interaction, their experience of knowing the natural world and working with what they could regain of classical learning in order to actually look at both the science, the art, the learning and the faith for a new age, have created something that means insular art looks back both to its prehistoric, its Celtic, its Germanic, its Mediterranean origins, but takes it into a new world. And this is the tipping point when we move from late antiquity into the Middle Ages. And these islands at the edge of the world are playing a really key part in that. Now, I'm very, very sorry that I haven't had time to show you everything else. If you look at Skellig Michael, you can see how close those 6th century monks' huts are related to those in Coptic monasteries in Egypt. You can see, for example, a coin minted for King Offa of Mercia at Tamworth in 773, modelled on one print minted in Baghdad earlier the same year, with Offa's name written next to that of Allah in Kufic script. A very, very small world. And before we leave, I must just show you a little bit of the Book of Kells. This is the great Q at the beginning of Luke's Gospel. That looks like a rather odd way of drawing a Q, would you say? It's modelled, I think, on the ground plan of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And it's said that in the 690s, a Frankish bishop called Arculf, on the way back from Jerusalem, coming through the Straits of Gibraltar in a storm, took a wrong turn and goes up the wrong side of Land's End, ends up spending Christmas on Iona, dictating his pilgrim accounts to the abbot and drawing plans of the holy places on wax tablets, which may be one of the things that is being recollected here. And the Book of Kells, of course, one of the great monuments of art, and every detail, the great Cairo here, modelled on that of Lindisfarne, but taking it in a new direction, where every detail, even here you've got 2 mice holding a wafer with a cross on, pinned down by 2 cats, who in turn are overcome by more mice. So again, the threat of evil, but ultimately overcome by everybody sticking together and working together. An absolute, absolute masterpiece and delight. Look at the way in which you've got the crucified Christ here behind the throne of John the Evangelist enthroned. Lots of things going on relating to the visible monuments on Iona, including these incredible high crosses that must have been made before they abandoned the island at the beginning of the 9th century, but which go on to inspire that whole wonderful sequence of Irish high crosses, which have been known as sermons in stone because they're covered with such rich iconography. And so it goes on, incredible works of Irish art, including great brooches such as the Roscrea and Tara brooches, liturgical metalwork such as the Derrynagh flam pattern, incredible buildings such as the Round Towers and those at Glendalough. And finally, the Picts, because we haven't mentioned them. This is a Pictish warrior riding home drunk one night, and these are the areas of Pictish sculpture. And we find incredible metalwork, again, being produced. We think that the Picts were possibly an indigenous pre-Indo-European peoples, and they have an incredibly complex series of symbols which still haven't been completely deciphered, rather like hieroglyphs, we think. A whole range of them. Some you can see are modelled on things like mirrors, combs. Some might be modelled on horse bits, broken spears, treaties. This is modelled obviously on the classical dolphin, clan badges, all sorts of things possibly going on there. And this is what happens when Pictish art meets Christian art around about 720 at the beautiful cross at Aberlemno, covered in seahorses and other antique devices. And on the back, a battle scene in which the Anglo-Saxons are being defeated by the Picts, and a triumphant Pictish broch, a building very distinctive to the Picts of this sort, and a cauldron for celebrating on the back. And so again, very, very, very rich sculptural traditions, again with a lot of Eastern influence coming in. And so I hope if you do get to read the book or any other books, what I've tried to do in my book is rather than treat all the different peoples and their cultures separately, is to actually bring them together and look at the points of synergy and the points when they come together and the points where they diverge. So hopefully you'll have fun with it and you can see a lot more of the images and see how some of the things that we think we know are actually even more amazing when we get to dig deeper into them. Thank you.